On a massive space station, far from Earth, a young Valian named Lyra stood quietly in the corner of her personal quarters. Her eyes glowed with a soft purple light, a feature of her alien race. The Valians were an ancient and powerful species, known across the galaxy for their advanced technology, peace-loving ways, and calm demeanor. They never let emotions rule their decisions. They were calm, controlled, and distant, or at least, that's how they seemed to others. Lyra was different. While most of her people followed the rules and traditions, she found herself fascinated by the unpredictable nature of humans. She had spent hours observing them from afar, studying their emotional reactions to situations, their expressions of love, anger, and joy. Lyra didn't understand it. Humans were so raw. They acted without thinking, and often without fear. Their feelings ran deep, and their connections to one another were intense. It was something that the Valian race could never fully comprehend. Her curiosity about humans had started long before, during a mission when she first encountered a small human colony. She was assigned to study their culture, but what she saw fascinated her in ways she couldn't explain. Humans laughed loudly, cried without shame, and fought with all their might over even the smallest of things. It was so different from the peaceful, orderly lives the Valians led. But it was also beautiful. Today, however, Lyra wasn't observing from a distance. She was experimenting on her own, something she'd never done before. In the privacy of her quarters, Lyra had decided to explore one of the human habits she'd seen: the act of pleasure, something the Valians viewed as unnecessary and even frowned upon. She didn't fully understand it, but her curiosity got the best of her. Alone in her room, she found herself in the middle of an experiment. It was new, strange, and something her people would never approve of. Suddenly, the door to her room slid open with a soft hiss, and a voice echoed from the hallway. Lyra. Lyra froze, her heart racing, as she quickly turned around. The door hadn't been locked. And now, standing in the doorway was Commander Jack Carter, a human she had met briefly earlier during a diplomatic meeting. He was tall, with short brown hair and a confident air about him. He had always seemed different from other humans. Where most humans were brash or emotional, Carter seemed calm, collected, and yet there was a certain intensity in his eyes that Lyra couldn't ignore. But now, in this awkward moment, Lyra realized that he had just caught her in the act. She had no idea how to respond. Her face flushed with a color that humans might call embarrassment, but the Valian species didn't show such emotions, at least not openly. Carter raised an eyebrow, taking a step closer. He was unfazed, but there was a small, amused grin on his face. "Well, this is unexpected," he said with a light chuckle. Lyra stood motionless, unsure of what to say or do. She was trained to keep her composure, but this wasn't something even a Valian could prepare for. She tried to speak, but the words seemed to stick in her throat. I wasn't expecting anyone," she finally managed to say, her voice coming out softer than she intended. I didn't think you would be here." Carter didn't seem upset or surprised. He simply looked at her with curiosity, a slight grin still on his face. "You're a scientist, right? Always studying human behavior. Guess this was one thing you missed." Lyra blinked, confused by his bluntness. She had been studying humans, true, but she hadn't expected someone to walk in on her private exploration. This was not how she had imagined her first true interaction with a human would go. She stopped herself, trying to regain some control. "I didn't mean to." Carter shrugged and stepped further into the room. "It's okay. Really, no big deal. Humans do weird things all the time. But I guess you were curious about us, huh?" Lyra felt a rush of emotion that she had never experienced before. This human wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't ashamed. In fact, he seemed almost entertained. How could he be so relaxed? Why wasn't he disgusted? The Valians would never react this way. They would call it improper. But Carter, with his human confidence, was different. He crossed his arms and leaned against the wall, still smiling. Curious about how we live, how we feel, how we connect with each other, right? I get it, but humans, we don't hide who we are. We wear our feelings on our sleeves. What you saw, that's just one small part of us. Lyra's mind raced. He was right. Humans were open with their emotions in ways her people never could be. But she couldn't understand how that was a strength. It seemed like such a weakness, so vulnerable, so exposed. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. So, Carter continued, breaking the silence. What else have you been studying about humans, or is this a personal experiment? He raised an eyebrow with a teasing look. Lyra's mind was swirling. She didn't know what to say. All she knew was that her interest in humans had just grown 1,000 times more intense. What was it about them that made them so fearless, so open? And why, despite everything she had been taught, did she feel drawn to them? This wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was something deeper, something she couldn't explain. And she was starting to realize that meeting Commander Jack Carter might be the start of a journey that would change her life, and her understanding of what it truly meant to be alive. The room was quiet now, except for the soft hum of the space station's engines. Lyra felt the tension in the air, her heart racing. She had never been caught like this before. Her people, the Valians, were known for their control and discipline. But here she was, standing in front of a human who had just seen her in the most vulnerable way possible. Carter was still leaning against the wall, his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on her with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. He didn't seem uncomfortable at all. In fact, he seemed almost relaxed. Lyra, on the other hand, felt like the walls were closing in on her. She could feel her cheeks burning with embarrassment, but she did her best to hide it. I didn't expect anyone to come in, she said again, her voice softer this time. It was the only excuse she could think of, and even that didn't seem to help. Carter had already seen everything. There was no taking it back. You didn't lock the door, he pointed out with a smirk. His voice was calm, like this wasn't the most awkward moment of her life. Guess you weren't really trying to keep anyone out. Lyra was silent. She didn't know how to respond to that. She had been so caught up in her experiment that she hadn't even thought about the door. It was supposed to be a private moment, a quiet exploration of something she had only observed from afar. But now it was a mess, and she was standing in front of a human who wasn't judging her, wasn't angry, just watching. What do you think? Carter asked, breaking the silence. About humans, I mean. I can tell you've been watching us for a while. Lyra felt the weight of his question. She hadn't expected him to be so direct, so open about it. The truth was, she had been watching humans for a long time, studying their behaviors, trying to understand them. But now that she was standing face to face with one, it felt different. She had always thought of humans as strange, unpredictable creatures. But now she was starting to question her own beliefs. I think you're complicated, Lyra finally admitted, her voice barely a whisper. You're nothing like us. You feel everything so intensely, and it's overwhelming. Carter raised an eyebrow, surprised by her honesty. You think that's a bad thing? His smile softened, and he took a step closer, but there was no threat in his movement. It was like he was simply interested in hearing more. Lyra hesitated, her mind racing. The Valian way of life was one of peace and control. Their emotions were kept in check, never allowed to interfere with their logic or decisions. They didn't allow themselves to be ruled by passion, by desire. It was something they prided themselves on. But humans were completely different. They wore their emotions like armor, never afraid to show who they were, even in the most private moments. No, she said slowly, shaking her head. I don't think it's bad, but I don't understand it. How can you live like this? How do you keep from losing control? We, my people, believe in control, in restraint. Carter took another step closer, his eyes softening as he looked at her. You think we don't have control? He paused, letting the question hang in the air. Humans have control, but it's not the kind you're used to. We control ourselves, but in a different way. We let our emotions out, sure, but we also deal with them. We don't hide from them, and we don't let them rule us either. Lyra's eyes widened slightly. She hadn't thought about it like that. She had always assumed that humans' openness was a weakness, but Carter was saying something different. Maybe it wasn't weakness. Maybe it was strength in a way she hadn't understood before. For a moment, they just stood there in silence. Lyra's mind was spinning, processing everything Carter had said. The way he spoke was so simple, so clear, yet it made her question everything she had believed about her own people. Could it be that the Valians, in their quest for control, had lost something important? Something that humans still had. Carter broke the silence again, his voice warm and inviting. "So, what's next for you, Lyra?" Still curious about us. Lyra looked at him, unsure of how to answer. The truth was, she was more than just curious. She was drawn to him in a way that she couldn't explain. The more she learned about humans, the more fascinated she became. But what was this strange feeling inside her? Was it admiration, or something else? She didn't know, but she couldn't deny it. I want to understand more," she said, her voice firm. "There's something about humans that I can't ignore, something that my people don't have." Carter smiled, his eyes bright with an expression Lyra had never seen before. "That's a start," he said, his tone light. "I think you'll find there's a lot more to us than you might expect." Lyra didn't know what to say to that. She was standing at the edge of something new, something that could change everything she had known about herself, her people, and maybe even the universe. And it all started with a simple moment of curiosity. But for now, she didn't need to say anything more. The questions would come later, and so would the answers. For the first time in her life, Lyra wasn't afraid to learn. She wasn't afraid to feel. The days that followed were strange for Lyra. The space station, which had once felt so familiar, now seemed different. It was like everything she had known about her people, her race, was being questioned. And the source of her confusion was none other than Commander Jack Carter, the human she had met under the most awkward of circumstances. He was everywhere now, his presence in the corridors, his voice during their brief conversations, and his unshakable confidence. But it wasn't just his presence that was hard for her to ignore. It was his way of thinking, his way of being. Lyra found herself thinking about their last conversation more than she cared to admit. How did humans live with such raw emotions? Carter had claimed that their feelings didn't control them, but Lyra couldn't quite understand that. In her world, emotions were something to be controlled, locked away. They didn't just let them flow freely, but humans seemed to embrace their feelings, face them head-on. Could it be that they were stronger because of it? As much as she tried to push those thoughts away, they kept coming back. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was something deeper, a desire to understand, to see for herself what made humans so different. And as strange as it was, she found herself wanting to spend more time with Carter. One afternoon, Lyra found herself walking down one of the station's long corridors, lost in thought. She wasn't paying attention to where she was going until she accidentally bumped into someone. Looking up, she saw Carter standing there with a mischievous smile on his face. Well, he said, crossing his arms over his chest. "You're really in a world of your own, aren't you?" Lyra blinked, startled, but quickly composed herself. "I wasn't expecting you," she said, though she didn't quite know why. She had been thinking about him. Again. Carter laughed softly. "I'm not always going to be a surprise, you know. We'll have to work on that." Lyra frowned slightly. "I didn't expect humans to be so persistent," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Carter's smile widened. "We're a persistent bunch, all right. But that's because we don't give up on things that matter to us. And I think you're starting to see that." He leaned in slightly, his expression more serious now. "So, what do you really think about us, Lyra? No more pretending. What's really going on in that head of yours?" Lyra stared at him for a moment, unsure of how to respond. She wasn't used to being so direct, especially not with someone like him, a human. But for some reason, Carter's question didn't seem so threatening. In fact, it felt almost inviting. Like he wanted to know her thoughts, her true feelings. "I think," she started slowly, choosing her words carefully, "that you humans are strange. You're so open, so emotional. It's unlike anything I've ever seen. And yet, you don't seem weak because of it. It's confusing." Carter raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Confusing? How so?" Lyra hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "You act without thinking sometimes. You do things that seem reckless. But then, when the situation gets tough, you just deal with it. You don't fall apart. You keep going." Carter nodded thoughtfully. "That's the human way. We don't always know what's coming next, but we take each moment as it comes. It's not about hiding who we are, Lyra. It's about facing the world, even when it's hard, even when we don't know what we're doing." Lyra's eyes widened. It was exactly what she had seen in him. Despite all the chaos and unpredictability, humans found a way to keep moving forward. It wasn't like her people, who always maintained a perfect, calm exterior. Humans were messy, but there was something powerful about that mess. For a moment, the two stood there in silence, the weight of their conversation hanging between them. Lyra couldn't explain why, but she felt drawn to Carter in a way she hadn't felt before. He wasn't like anyone she had ever met, human or otherwise. There was something about his confidence, his openness, that made her want to learn more about him, and about humans in general. "Do you ever feel afraid?" she asked quietly, her voice softer now. "I mean, with everything you face, with the way you live. How do you deal with fear?" Carter smiled again, but this time it was a little more serious. "Fear's a part of life, Lyra. Everyone feels it. But the difference is what we do with it. Some people run from it. Others fight it. But most of us, we just keep going. Fear doesn't control us. We control how we respond to it." Lyra was silent, her mind racing. She had never thought about fear like that before. In her world, fear was something to be avoided. But here, Carter was saying that fear was something to be confronted, something to face. She wasn't sure if she could do that. But the more she listened to him, the more she realized that maybe, just maybe, humans had a way of living that was worth learning. "You're different," Lyra said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're not like anything I've ever known." Carter smiled, his eyes softening as he looked at her. "And you're not like anyone I've ever met either. But I think that's what makes this so interesting." Lyra nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. There was still so much she didn't understand about humans, about Carter, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was on the verge of discovering something important, something that could change everything. And as she stood there, talking to a human, she realized that maybe, just maybe, the most important discoveries weren't about technology or the stars, but about understanding what it really meant to be alive, to feel, to live without fear. The days that followed felt like a blur to Lyra. The thoughts swirling in her mind about humans, about emotions, and about Carter were impossible to ignore. It seemed like everywhere she went, she kept bumping into him. Whether it was in the hallways of the space station or during brief meetings, Carter was always there, his presence a constant reminder of everything she was trying to understand. Lyra had been studying humans for so long, but it was only now that she realized how little she actually knew. Humans weren't just chaotic, emotional creatures. They were resilient. They were strong in ways she hadn't even begun to comprehend. And Carter, the human who had so easily walked into her life, was the embodiment of that strength. One evening, Lyra found herself alone in one of the observation rooms of the space station. It was quiet, and the stars outside glowed softly against the dark expanse of space. She stared out at the endless void, her thoughts a whirlwind. How could she explain what was happening inside her? How could she put into words the strange feelings she had for Carter? She had never experienced anything like this before. But for some reason, when she thought of him, her heart beat faster, and it wasn't just because he was human. There was something deeper there. Suddenly, she heard the door to the observation room open. She turned to see Carter walking in, looking as calm and confident as ever. "Thought I might find you here," he said with a grin, his eyes scanning the room before settling on her. Lyra didn't say anything at first. She just looked at him, surprised by how much his presence seemed to calm her. Despite everything that was so new and confusing, being near him felt right. She wasn't sure if she could explain it, but she felt a strange sense of peace when he was around. Carter crossed the room, coming to stand beside her at the window. "You're always so serious," he said, his voice light. "What's on your mind this time?" Lyra hesitated. She wasn't sure if she could put her thoughts into words, but Carter had a way of making her feel like she could share anything. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said. The way humans deal with their emotions," she began. "You said fear doesn't control you. But sometimes, I don't know, I think fear controls me." Carter turned to face her, his expression softening. "Fear doesn't have to control anyone, Lyra. Fear is just a feeling. It's a signal that something's important, that something matters, but it doesn't have to stop you from living your life. The trick is to face it, to feel it, and then move forward anyway." Lyra looked down at the floor, her thoughts racing. It sounded so simple when he said it, but how could she just face fear? How could she allow herself to feel those emotions without it overwhelming her? "I don't know if I can do that," she said quietly. "I've spent my whole life learning to control everything, to keep my emotions hidden. And now I don't know what to do with all of this." Carter placed a hand gently on her shoulder, a simple gesture that sent a rush of warmth through her. "You don't have to do anything right away," he said. "You don't have to have all the answers. Just take it one step at a time. Emotions are like waves. They come and go. The important thing is not to fight them. Let them come, let them pass, and keep going." Lyra looked up at him, meeting his gaze. She saw sincerity in his eyes. He believed what he was saying, and for the first time, she found herself believing it too. "I've never had anyone speak to me like this before," Lyra admitted. "You make it sound so easy, but it's not easy for me. I've always believed that keeping control was the only way to stay strong." Carter smiled softly. "I think control is important, but it's not the only thing that matters. Sometimes, letting go is just as strong as holding on. You've got to be willing to experience everything, both the good and the bad. That's where true strength comes from." Lyra's mind was swirling. Could he be right? Could there be strength in vulnerability, in letting go of control? It was a concept that was completely foreign to her, but something about Carter's words resonated deeply within her. It was like a light had been switched on in the dark corners of her mind. For the first time, she allowed herself to take a deep breath, to simply exist in the moment. There was something incredibly freeing about not having to hide her thoughts and emotions anymore. It didn't mean she had to give up control entirely, but it meant she could start to understand her feelings without fear. "I still don't know how to face my fear," Lyra said, her voice softer now. "But maybe I can start by accepting that it's there." Carter nodded, his smile widening. "Exactly. That's the first step. Once you accept it, it won't have power over you anymore." They stood in silence for a moment, both lost in their own thoughts. Lyra felt a strange sense of peace settling over her, a peace that came from knowing that she didn't have to have all the answers right now. She didn't have to fix everything. She could just be. And for the first time, that felt like enough. "You know," Carter said, breaking the silence with a teasing grin, "I think you're starting to understand humans more than you think." Lyra looked at him, her eyes meeting his with a mix of wonder and curiosity. "Maybe," she said with a small smile, "but there's still so much more to learn." Carter's grin grew wider. Good. That's the spirit. And I'm happy to help you along the way. As they stood there, looking out at the stars together, Lyra felt a shift inside herself. She wasn't the same person she had been when she first arrived at the space station. The walls she had built around her emotions were starting to crumble, and for the first time, she wasn't afraid of it. In that moment, Lyra realized that understanding humans wasn't just about studying their behaviors. It was about understanding herself. And maybe, just maybe, it was the most important thing she could ever learn. The days passed, and Lyra felt like she was slowly but surely changing. She had started to see the world in a different way. A lot of things that had once seemed complicated or impossible to understand now felt a little clearer. It was all thanks to the conversations she'd had with Carter, the human who had challenged everything she thought she knew about strength, emotions, and what it meant to truly live. Lyra found herself more and more drawn to Carter. It wasn't just the way he thought or the way he made her question everything. It was his kindness, his patience, and how easily he made her feel seen, even when she didn't know how to express herself. One afternoon, as the space station drifted quietly through the stars, Lyra found herself waiting outside the control room. She had just finished a long day of research, and she was eager to talk to Carter. Over the past few weeks, they had spent more time together. They would talk about everything and nothing, from the technical aspects of the station's systems to the mysteries of the universe. But more than anything, their conversations were always filled with an openness that Lyra had never experienced before. When the door to the control room slid open, Carter stepped out, his usual confident smile lighting up his face when he saw her. "You're always waiting for me these days," he teased, his voice warm and friendly. Lyra smiled back, though it was a little more nervous than usual. "I thought we could talk. You know, about humans. And maybe about me." Carter raised an eyebrow. His interest piqued. "About you? Well, now you've got my attention. What's on your mind?" Lyra shifted slightly, feeling her nerves rise. She had never been this open before, never allowed herself to be so vulnerable. But there was something in Carter's eyes that made her feel safe, as though she could say anything without fear of judgment. "I've been thinking," she began slowly, "about what you said, about fear, about how humans deal with it. You were right. I've spent my whole life keeping my emotions under control, hiding them. But now, I'm not so sure it's the right way. It feels like I've been building walls around myself, and I don't know how to break them down." Carter's expression softened, and he stepped closer. "You're doing better than you think," he said gently. "Admitting it is the first step. You've already started breaking down those walls. You're here, talking to me, being honest with yourself. That's huge." Lyra felt a weight lift off her shoulders. It was true. She was talking to him, being honest, something that hadn't come easily to her. "I don't know how to handle all these feelings. There are so many of them. I feel like they're going to swallow me whole if I let them out." Carter nodded, his eyes understanding. "I get that, but you don't have to handle them all at once. It's okay to take it slow. Just start with one thing at a time. You don't have to fix everything today. We all deal with our emotions in different ways. But that's part of being human, being okay with the mess." Lyra felt the truth of his words settle in her chest. For so long, she had believed that emotions were something to be fixed, something to control. But now she was beginning to understand that they weren't problems to solve. They were just a part of who she was, and it was okay to let them be. "I think I'm afraid," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Afraid of what will happen if I stop trying to control everything." Carter smiled softly. "That's normal. Fear is a part of life. It doesn't go away just because you want it to, but that doesn't mean it has to stop you. You just have to trust yourself enough to let go." Lyra took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions that swirled inside her. It was hard to trust herself, especially when she had spent so long denying parts of who she was. But she knew that Carter was right. The fear didn't need to control her anymore. "What if I make a mistake?" she asked, looking up at him, her eyes full of uncertainty. Carter chuckled softly. "You will. We all do. But mistakes are just lessons in disguise. They're how we learn. It's how we grow. You don't have to be perfect, Lyra. Just be yourself. That's all anyone can ask for." Lyra felt something shift inside her. She had spent so much of her life trying to be perfect, trying to live up to the standards set by her people, by her society. But maybe, just maybe, perfection wasn't the answer. Maybe it was okay to make mistakes. Maybe it was okay to just be. For the first time, she felt a wave of relief wash over her. She didn't have to be anything other than herself, and that was enough. Carter looked at her with a proud smile. "See, you're already starting to get it." Lyra smiled back, feeling a sense of peace she had never known before. "I think I am." They stood there for a moment, the hum of the space station and the soft glow of the stars outside filling the silence between them. Lyra realized that the barriers she had built around herself were slowly crumbling. And as they fell away, she was starting to discover who she truly was, someone who didn't have to be perfect, someone who didn't have to control everything, someone who could just live. "I don't know what the future holds," Lyra said quietly, "but I think I'm ready to face it. Even with all the uncertainty, I think I'm ready." Carter's grin widened, and he placed a hand on her shoulder. "I believe in you, Lyra, and I'll be here to help you through it. You don't have to face it alone." Lyra nodded, her heart full of gratitude and something else, something she couldn't quite name yet. But it was there, growing stronger every day. And for the first time in her life, Lyra felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Lyra had always been someone who avoided conflict. She had learned early on that staying calm, staying collected was the key to survival. In her world, it was better to keep your thoughts to yourself than risk saying something that might make others uncomfortable. But now, with Carter by her side, she was starting to see that there was another way to live, a way that didn't involve hiding behind walls or pretending to be something she wasn't. Over the past few weeks, Lyra had grown closer to Carter, and their conversations had become more open, more personal. She found herself sharing things she never thought she would. Fears, hopes, and even dreams. But there was one thing she had kept hidden, one part of herself that she hadn't yet shared. It was the truth about her past, a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Carter had noticed that Lyra was quieter than usual one afternoon. They had been working together on a project in the station's main lab. But today, Lyra's focus seemed to drift. She wasn't paying attention to the data on the screen in front of her, and her mind seemed a million miles away. "Lyra?" Carter's voice cut through her thoughts, pulling her back to the present. "You okay?" She blinked, surprised by the question. She hadn't realized how much her thoughts had wandered. "I'm fine," she said quickly, though the words didn't feel true. Carter didn't buy it. He leaned against the console, crossing his arms. "You don't seem fine. You've been off all day. Talk to me." Lyra hesitated. She wanted to tell him the truth, but the words were stuck in her throat. There was so much she hadn't told him about her past, about where she came from, about the choices she had made. It wasn't that she didn't trust Carter. It was just that facing the truth felt like opening a door she wasn't ready to walk through. But she knew that if she didn't face it now, it would continue to weigh on her, growing heavier with each passing day. Finally, she took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "There's something I haven't told you," she began slowly, her voice quieter than usual. "Something about my past. Something I've never shared with anyone." Carter's expression softened, and he nodded. "You don't have to tell me if you're not ready, Lyra. But if you want to talk, I'm here." Lyra appreciated his kindness, but she knew that she couldn't keep hiding forever. It was time to face the truth. "I come from a place where emotions are controlled," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "We're taught to keep them in check, to never let anyone see our weaknesses. I spent my whole life doing that, hiding my feelings, burying everything deep inside, and I thought it was the only way to stay strong. She paused, trying to find the right words to explain the rest. But there's something else. Something I didn't choose. I was part of a group that did things. Things I'm not proud of. I hurt people. I hurt innocent people, and I thought it was justified because it was for the greater good. But now, I don't know if I can live with it. Carter's eyes never left hers as she spoke, his expression a mix of concern and understanding. He didn't interrupt, didn't try to tell her everything would be okay. He just listened, giving her the space to say what she needed to say. I thought I could outrun it. Lyra continued, her voice shaky now. That if I came here, if I became someone else, I could leave my past behind. But every time I think I've moved on, the guilt comes back. The shame. I don't know if I can ever forgive myself for what I did. There was a long pause as Carter let her words sink in. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm and steady. You've been carrying this for a long time, haven't you? It's like a weight that's been on your shoulders. But Lyra, you're not the same person you were then. What you did doesn't define you. It's part of your past, but it's not who you are now. Lyra looked at him, her eyes filled with doubt. How can you say that? How can you look at me and not see what I've done? Carter took a step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. Because I see you, Lyra. I see the person you are now. And that person is strong. You're learning, you're growing, and you're not running from who you were. You're facing it. That's what matters. Lyra felt something shift inside her. For the first time in a long time, she felt like maybe she could forgive herself. Maybe she didn't have to carry the weight of her past forever. Maybe, just maybe, she could start fresh. I don't know if I can ever make up for what I did, Lyra whispered, her voice filled with regret. But I don't want to be that person anymore. I want to be someone better. You already are, Carter said quietly. You've already started. Lyra felt a tear slip down her cheek, but it wasn't a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of release, of letting go of the shame that had held her captive for so long. I don't know what the future holds, she said, her voice stronger now. But I think I'm ready to face it. I'm ready to let go of my past. Carter smiled, his eyes filled with pride. That's all anyone can do. Let go of the past and move forward. For the first time in a long time, Lyra felt a sense of peace. She didn't have all the answers, but she didn't need them. She had Carter by her side, and for the first time, she was ready to face the truth of who she was, without fear. The days after Lyra's conversation with Carter felt different, lighter in a way. The weight she had carried for so long, the burden of guilt, fear, and the past, wasn't completely gone, but it was fading. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was running from herself. Instead, she was standing tall, facing the person she had once been, and moving forward with a sense of peace. Carter had been there every step of the way, offering quiet support and kind words. He didn't push her, didn't force her to rush through the healing process. He simply let her be, giving her the space to figure things out on her own. And in doing so, he had become more than just a friend. He had become someone Lyra could trust completely. It wasn't long before they found themselves spending even more time together. They would talk about anything and everything. Science, the mysteries of space, their hopes for the future. But more often than not, their conversations turned personal. Lyra found herself opening up in ways she never thought possible. She didn't feel judged by Carter, didn't feel like her past defined her anymore. It was as though, together, they were creating a new path for her, one where she could be free from the past and embrace the person she was becoming. One evening, as the station drifted through the endless expanse of space, Carter invited Lyra to join him on a trip to the observation deck. The stars were shining brightly, their distant light twinkling like tiny diamonds against the black sky. Lyra stood beside Carter at the large window, gazing out at the view. She had seen this sight many times before, but tonight it felt different. There was a sense of wonder in the air, a sense of possibility. The vastness of space, once so overwhelming, now seemed like an open canvas, waiting for her to paint her own story. Carter turned to her, his expression soft but sincere. "You've come a long way, Lyra. I've seen the change in you, and I'm proud of you." Lyra smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She had never been good at accepting compliments, but coming from Carter, it felt genuine, like he truly saw her. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said quietly. "You've been so patient, so kind. I don't think I would have been able to face my past without your support." Carter shook his head, his smile never fading. "You've done the hard part, Lyra. You've faced your past, and you're learning to let go. That takes strength, more strength than most people ever realize." Lyra's heart swelled with gratitude. It wasn't just about the support he had given her. It was about the way he had made her feel like she wasn't alone in this journey. He had shown her that she didn't have to hide behind walls anymore, that it was okay to be vulnerable, to be imperfect. That was the greatest gift he could have given her. They stood there for a long time, just taking in the view together. The hum of the station's engines was a gentle background noise, a constant reminder that they were moving forward, just like Lyra was. The stars outside seemed to sparkle brighter than ever before, and for the first time, Lyra felt like she had a place in the universe. As they turned to leave the observation deck, Carter paused and looked at her, a teasing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "So, what's next for you, Lyra? What do you want to do now?" Lyra blinked, caught off guard by the question. What did she want? For the first time in her life, the answer wasn't clear. She had always followed a path set by others, her people, her training, her purpose. But now she had a chance to choose for herself. She had the freedom to define her own future. "I don't know," she said slowly, "but I think I want to explore. I want to learn more about humans, about the universe. I want to see the beauty in the things I've never noticed before." Lyra's heart beat a little faster at his words. She hadn't expected to feel this way, but with Carter, she felt a sense of safety and adventure all at once. Maybe this was what it meant to live, to be free, to choose, to embrace both the good and the bad, and to find joy in the journey. As they walked through the station's halls, Lyra felt a sense of excitement building inside her. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid of it. She had a lot to learn, a lot to explore, and most importantly, she had the courage to face whatever came next. With Carter by her side, Lyra knew that anything was possible, and that thought filled her with a sense of peace and anticipation for the next chapter of her life. For the first time in years, Lyra felt truly free.